Every mystery has a voice. Few dare to listen.
The rain over the marshlands did not merely fall. It executed a deliberate, sodden siege against the mullioned windows of Oakhaven Priory. It blew in from the wash, smelling faintly of rotting wrack and salt-crusted silt, whistling through the leaded panes with the high, thin note of a dying flute. In the library, Lord Peter Wimsey adjusted his monocle, leaned back against the deep crimson morocco of a wing chair that had seen better centuries, and regarded the corpse on the Persian rug with the pained, meticulous expression of an aesthetically sensitive man who had just discovered an unpardonable misprint in a first edition of Catullus. "The absurdity of the angle, Bunter," Lord Peter murmured, fanning himself languidly with a pristine silk handkerchief, "is what truly offends the senses. A gentleman may permit himself to be bludgeoned, stabbed, or even inconveniently poisoned by an inept cousin with an eye on the consoles. But to drop dead across a Tabriz carpet of the late Safavid period with one's neck bent at 45 degrees to the left is an outright assault upon symmetry." Mervyn Bunter, standing 3 paces behind his master with a silver tray clamped securely under one arm, did not allow his gaze to wander to the late Septimus Thorndyke, whose sightless eyes were currently staring into the embers of the hearth. "Indeed, my lord," Bunter replied, his voice a marvel of icy, deferential composure. "The rug, if I may observe, was cleaned only last Tuesday with a solution of ammonia and dried tea leaves. It is most regrettable that the late Mr. Thorndyke's collar stud should have snagged the weave in his descent." "A tragedy of interior decoration," Wimsey agreed smoothly. He rose, the crease in his trousers remaining miraculously undisturbed by his posture, and stepped lightly around the pooled shadow on the floor. "And yet, Superintendent Smedley appears convinced that the poor fellow simply collapsed under the sheer, unadulterated weight of his own solvency." Across the room, standing beside a heavy carved oak bureau that looked as though it had been hauled straight out of the Spanish Inquisition, Superintendent Smedley of the Lincolnshire Constabulary flushed a dark, dangerous brick red. He was a broad-shouldered man with a moustache that resembled a dried brushwood fence, and his boots creaked with aggressive, provincial authority whenever he shifted his weight. "Now see here, Lord Peter," Smedley rumbled, clearing his throat with a sound like gravel being turned in a tin bucket. "The local apothecary, Mr. Pringle, mind you, who's been certifying the deaths in this parish since the late Queen's second Jubilee, says it's a clear case of apoplexy. The old gentleman was 82. He had a neck like a prize fighter, a temper like a scalded cat, and he'd spent the last 2 hours screaming at his solicitors. A blood vessel gives way in the brain, pop, and down he goes. It happens every day in the country." "Apoplexy," Wimsey repeated, tasting the word on his tongue as though evaluating a doubtful sherry. "A delightful, robust, 19th century sort of word, full of port wine, high blood pressure, and fox hunting. The only difficulty, my dear Superintendent, is that Mr. Septimus Thorndyke never drank port, hated horses, and spent the last 40 years subsisting entirely on barley water, dry toast, and malice." "Malice," Smedley snorted, "isn't listed on the death certificate as a cause of heart failure, your lordship." "No," Wimsey sighed, strolling toward the great bay window that looked out over the drowned lawns. "More's the pity. If it were, half the peerage would be in Home Office jars at Guy's Hospital. But do tell me, what was the precise nature of the screecher that preceded the pop?" The third occupant of the room, who had hitherto remained huddled in a leather armchair near the far corner like a disconsolate crow, stirred with a faint rustle of starch and bombazine. This was Mr. Gabriel Vance, senior partner of Vance, Vance & Harker, an establishment that had managed the legal affairs of the Thorndyke estate since the reign of King George III. Mr. Vance possessed a face that appeared to have been carved out of turnip and subsequently left in a cellar to dry. "It was not a screecher, Lord Peter," Vance said, his voice dry as dead leaves scraping across flagstones. "It was a disagreement regarding the disposition of the codicil. Mr. Thorndyke was exceedingly particular regarding the phrasing. He insisted upon reading the manuscript aloud himself, despite the failing light." "Ah," Wimsey turned, his light blue eyes gleaming with an idle, almost vacuous curiosity that made those who did not know him thoroughly drop their guard. The famous will, the document that has brought half the ravenous vultures of the eastern counties to roost under this ancient, dripping roof. I understand he made a new one every time the wind changed from the southwest. He was an eccentric, my lord, Vance murmured primly, folding his long, ink-stained fingers together. It was his prerogative as the tenant for life of the priory and the sole holder of the Thorndyke debentures. The draft executed this afternoon revokes all previous testaments, including the instrument of 1921, which benefited his nephew, Mr. Julian, and the deed of gift toward the Diocesan Restoration Fund. And who? Wimsey asked, drifting back toward the corpse and tilting his head sideways to examine the heavy brass hearthrug stop. Is the fortunate soul currently floating on the crest of Mr. Thorndyke's final testamentary wave? The entire unencumbered estate, said Vance, dipping his head in a gesture that managed to be both mournful and profoundly hypocritical, passes unconditionally to his distant cousin, Mr. Alistair Thorndyke, formerly of the Malayan Civil Service, currently residing in the West Wing. Alistair? Wimsey raised an eyebrow. The gentleman who arrived 3 weeks ago with a collection of stuffed hornbills, a malaria twitch, and an utterly inexhaustible supply of stories regarding the humidity of Penang? The very same, Vance replied. How touching, Wimsey murmured. Blood is thicker than water, even when it has been diluted by 40 years of colonial gin and tonic. And where, pray, is the disinherited nephew, the unfortunate Julian? Mr. Julian, Superintendent Smedley interrupted with grim satisfaction, is currently down at the Black Bull, drowning his disappointment in bitter beer and making remarks regarding his late uncle that would border on criminal libel if the old man was still above ground to hear him. Splendid, said Wimsey cheerfully. A classic dramatic ensemble, the ruined heir in the local pub, the mysterious tropical cousin in the West Wing, the parchment-faced lawyer with the draft, and the corpse on the carpet. All we require now is a hooded monk in the gallery and a phantom hound on the gravel. There is no hound, my lord, Vance stated with total lack of humor, though there is, I believe, a persistent draft beneath the door of the portrait gallery. Wimsey knelt suddenly beside the body, his long, aristocratic fingers fluttering over the lapels of the dead man's velvet smoking jacket with the light, expert touch of a pianist running through a preliminary octave. Superintendent, he said softly, his voice dropping its light, mocking lilt for a fraction of a second, when Mr. Pringle conducted his preliminary inspection of this venerable ruin, did he happen to examine the throat? Smedley stepped forward, his creaking boots sounding like a ship's timber under strain. He looked at the mouth, my lord, tongue bitten slightly, common in seizures, face cyanotic. Classic signs. Quite, Wimsey said. Classic, beautifully classical, like a Greek tragedy, where all the really messy violence happens off stage and is reported by a messenger who isn't quite as stupid as he looks. He plucked a small silver object from his waistcoat pocket, a powerful magnifying glass mounted in tortoiseshell, and brought it within an inch of the late Septimus Thorndyke's left lapel. Bunter, Wimsey murmured without looking up. My lord? Observe the nap of the velvet just beneath the collarbone. What do you make of it? Bunter stepped forward, leaned down with mechanical precision, and peered through the lens. It appears to have been brushed against the grain, my lord, quite violently, if I may say so, as though a heavy weight had been dragged across it, or as though someone had pinned the late gentleman against a hard surface before he took his final apoplectic tumble. And the smell, Bunter? You have an exquisite nose for domestic scents. Bunter leaned an eighth of an inch closer, his nostrils flaring slightly. I detect the smell of carbolic soap, my lord, high-grade furniture polish, and an odor which I can only describe as burnt feathers combined with a faint trace of bitter almonds. Superintendent Smedley snorted loudly. Prussic acid. I knew it. Every amateur detective from London to John O'Groats wants prussic acid the moment a rich man dies in an armchair. My dear Smedley, Wimsey said, standing up and dusting his knees with a flutter of his fingers, I should be utterly devastated if it were prussic acid. Prussic acid is so dreadfully cliché. It belongs to cheap yellowbacks and suburban melodramas. No, whatever killed Septimus Thorndyke was far more subtle, far more personal, and infinitely more vulgar. He turned his back on the body and walked toward the great fireplace, where the logs were spitting blue flames, a sure sign, the locals said, of sea coal or an impending death in the house. "Mr. Vance," Wimsey said, leaning his arm against the mantelpiece and gazing down at the turnip-faced solicitor, "when Mr. Thorndyke fell, where were you standing?" "I was at the table, my lord," Vance replied promptly, pointing to the bureau 5 yards away. "I was blotting the signature on the codicil. And Mr. Alistair Thorndyke?" "He was standing by the window, the very window where your lordship was just looking out. He was observing the rain, a riveting occupation," Wimsey remarked, "and the front door was locked." "It is always locked at dusk, my lord," Vance said, "by the butler, Grimble." "Ah, yes," Wimsey said, his eye catching a minute flicker of motion in the shadow of the velvet curtains that draped the entrance to the library. "The inimitable Grimble, the man who looks like an executioner who has taken holy orders. Is he currently outside the door, or is he merely listening through the keyhole with his usual professional zeal?" The heavy velvet curtain swayed, and a tall, gaunt figure stepped into the room with the silence of an oil slick. He had a face like a tombstone that had been scrubbed with lye, and his hands were folded across his lower waist in an attitude of perpetual, sinister mourning. "I was merely waiting to ascertain, my lord," Grimble said in a voice that sounded like iron gates turning on rusty hinges, "whether his lordship and the police officers would require tea before the coroner's van arrives. The muffins are becoming somewhat leathery." Wimsey smiled, a wide, foolish, sunshiny smile that transformed his sharp face into that of a slightly brainless young man about town. "Muffins, Grimble, how utterly delightful. Nothing assists the process of criminal investigation quite like a warm, buttery muffin. Do bring them in. And Grimble—" "Yes, my lord, do be a good fellow and tell me who turned the clock in the hall back 20 minutes before the old gentleman expired." The room fell so silent that the patter of the rain against the glass sounded like the scattering of dried peas on a drum. Grimble did not blink. Superintendent Smedley frowned with massive, bewildered dignity. Mr. Vance's turnip-like countenance seemed to harden into granite. "The hall clock, my lord," Grimble said coldly, "has not been altered since the late king's funeral. It is a deadbeat escapement by Tompion. It does not lose time." "It doesn't lose time, no," Wimsey agreed mildly, taking a silver cigarette case from his pocket and tapping a Turkish against his thumbnail. "But it certainly gained 20 minutes between 4 o'clock and 5, unless my own watch, which was adjusted this morning by Benson's of Old Bond Street, has suddenly succumbed to a localized magnetic storm brought on by the Malayan hornbills in the west wing." He struck a match, the tiny yellow flame illuminating the sharp, bird-like intensity of his features for a single, fleeting second before he blew it out. "We are in for a most entertaining night, Smedley," Lord Peter murmured, exhaling a long, thin plume of blue smoke toward the ceiling. "The dead man has left us a will that leaves everything to the wrong cousin, a clock that moves backward, and a smell of burnt feathers where no bird has ever flown. Bunter, fetch my thickest boots and the heavy torch. I feel an irresistible urge to go and inspect the drains." The mud of the Oakhaven Priory estate did not merely cling. It possessed an aggressive, greasy tenacity born of centuries of marshland silt and decay. Outside the library's French windows, the terrace gave way to a sunken garden that had long since surrendered its gravel paths to moss, liverwort, and sprawling nettles. The beam of Bunter's heavy brass torch cut through the gloom like a solid yellow rod, illuminating the fine grey veil of rain that continued to sweep across the fen. Lord Peter Wimsey stepped off the flagstones onto the sodden turf, his collar turned up against the damp chill, his trousers tucked carefully into the tops of his heavy leather boots. He moved with a light, springing tread that seemed oddly at odds with the solemnity of the night, pausing every few paces to sweep his own smaller pocket lens over the saturated ground. "You see, Bunter," Wimsey remarked, his voice muffled slightly by the wool of his scarf, "the chief difficulty with an old family house is that everyone assumes its secrets are buried in the cellar or hidden behind a sliding panel in the wainscot. People have a positively Victorian affection for secret passages, but the truly interesting things, the really vulgar and informative things, almost invariably happen on the threshold. I have frequently observed, my lord, Bunter replied, holding the large torch steady with one hand while using his free arm to shield its glass from the splatter of rain. That gentleman who would never dream of leaving a thumbprint upon a brass doorknob display a remarkable lack of caution regarding the heels of their boots. The turf beneath the third drainpipe, my lord, appears to have suffered some violence. Wimsey knelt, heedless of the water soaking through his trousers at the knee, and brought his face within 6 inches of the black, saturated earth. Near the heavy cast-iron downspout that drained the roof of the library, the soil had been churned into a soft, dark paste. But beneath the fresh mud, clearly preserved in a patch of sheltered clay under the eaves, lay a distinct, crisp impression. It was the mark of a heel, narrow, slightly worn on the outer edge, and fitted with a row of tiny, square-headed iron nails. "Not Superintendent Smedley," Wimsey murmured, tracing the edge of the print with the tip of his silver pencil. "Smedley wears the stout, honest, double-soled boot of the Lincolnshire Constabulary, broad at the toe and studded like a church door. Not Vance, whose feet are as flat and respectable as his legal opinions, and certainly not poor old Septimus, who wore velvet slippers indoors and soft felt galoshes when he ventured out to torment the head gardener. Mr. Alistair Thorndyke, my lord," Bunter offered softly, "is accustomed to footwear constructed for tropical climates. I took the liberty of examining his luggage while assisting the local lad with a portmanteau earlier this evening. His boots were crafted by a firm in Singapore. They feature a distinct pattern of brass tacking along the arch." "Did they indeed?" Wimsey stood up, wiping his muddy knee with a handkerchief that had already seen better days. How deliciously thoughtful of him, a gentleman who collects Malayan birds and brings his own tropical heels to an English country house in November is a boon to any right-thinking investigator. "But look here, Bunter, what do you make of this line?" He pointed his silver pencil toward the stone wall of the library. A thin, dark scratch ran vertically down the moss-covered ashlar, starting from the heavy stone sill of the library window and terminating near the top of the rainpipe. Clinging to a rough projection in the masonry, roughly 4 feet above the ground, was a tiny tuft of coarse, grey fibre. Wimsey plucked it with a pair of delicate steel tweezers from his pocket case and held it up to the light of Bunter's torch. "Hemp," Wimsey said, sniffing it delicately. "Coarse, unbleached hemp, smelling faintly of tar and, yes, there it is again, that distinct, slightly acrid tang of machine oil. Someone has been lowering something heavy from that window, or perhaps climbing up to it. And yet when we entered the room, the window was latched from the inside with a brass fastener that looked as though it hadn't been greased since the Great Exhibition. If I might hazard a suggestion, my lord," Bunter said, his tone as flat and even as a billiard table, "the late Mr. Thorndyke was profoundly deaf in his left ear. It was his custom, as the household staff informs me, to sit with his right side toward the door and his left toward the garden window while reviewing his accounts. Which means," Wimsey said, his eyes narrowing as he looked up at the darkened window, "that an elephant could have scaled that drainpipe, played a fanfare on a trombone, and lowered a grand piano onto the terrace without Mr. Septimus Thorndyke noticing a thing, provided, of course, that the elephant stayed on his left side and refrained from vibrating the floorboards. He turned on his heel and began to walk briskly back toward the side entrance of the priory, his mind clearly working through a maze of interlocking possibilities. "Come, Bunter, let us return to the realm of high legal drama. I suspect Mr. Vance is currently attempting to explain to Superintendent Smedley why a draft of a will, unsigned and unverified, should carry the weight of Holy Writ, while the disinherited nephew is likely halfway through his 3rd pint of dark ale and contemplating arson." They re-entered the house through the gun room, a chilly, flag-stoned chamber smelling of gun oil, wet spaniels, and damp tweed. As Wimsey shed his wet coat, the sound of raised voices drifted down the long oak-paneled corridor that led toward the great hall. One voice was the thick, booming baritone of Superintendent Smedley, The other was a lighter, sharper, more volatile tenor that rasped with cold fury. Wimsey glided down the hallway with silent efficiency, Bunter following at a respectful 2 paces. They stopped just outside the open door of the morning room. Framed in the doorway stood Julian Thorndyke, the late old man's nephew. He was a young man of 28, with the sharp, handsome, slightly fox-like features characteristic of the Thorndyke family, though his eyes were heavy-rimmed and bloodshot. His evening clothes were slightly rumpled, his black tie sitting crookedly against his collar, and his hands trembled as he gestured wildly toward the heavy mahogany table where the solicitor, Mr. Vance, sat meticulously folding sheets of blue ledger paper. "It's a monstrous swindle, I tell you," Julian was shouting, his voice tight with suppressed panic. "The old man was out of his mind. He's been out of his mind for 6 months. He thought the gardener was poisoning his hydrangeas with Paris green, and he spent last Tuesday writing letters to the Prime Minister about the decline of the copper market. You can't tell me a document produced under those conditions has any standing in law, my dear Mr. Julian," Vance said smoothly, not even looking up from his paper. "Your late uncle's mental capacity was thoroughly evaluated by Dr. Pringle as recently as last month. He was declared entirely compos mentis, eccentric, undoubtedly, irascible, undeniably, but legally competent to dispose of his real and personal property as he saw fit." "Convenient," Julian spat, stepping closer to the table and leaning over it like a bird of prey. "Exceedingly convenient for Alistair. The man drops out of the sky after 20 years in the jungle, moves into the West Wing with his damned stuffed birds, and within 3 weeks my uncle cuts off the line of succession that has stood since 1840. Where is Alistair, anyway? Why isn't he here to defend this disgraceful piece of parchment?" "Mr. Alistair," Superintendent Smedley growled, stepping between the young man and the table, "is currently in his quarters, suffering from an acute return of his ague. The shock of his cousin's sudden passing, combined with the damp air of the marshes, has brought on a severe chill. I've advised him to remain in bed." "Ague?" Julian laughed bitterly, a sharp, unpleasant sound that echoed off the high ceiling. "He has an ague whenever there's honest work to be done, or awkward questions to be answered. He was as spry as a goat at 4 o'clock when he was whispering in the old man's ear about my debts at Newmarket." Wimsey stepped casually into the room, leaning his shoulder against the doorframe and regarding the scene with an expression of faint, sleepy amusement. "Do go on, my dear Julian," Wimsey murmured, pulling out his gold cigarette case. "There is nothing quite like a domestic dispute over a corpse to restore one's faith in the enduring strength of family ties. But do tell me, was it Newmarket, or was it that little affair regarding the promissory notes in London that caused your uncle's temperature to rise so alarmingly this afternoon?" Julian whipped around, his jaw setting hard as he recognized the thin, elegant figure in the doorway. "Wimsey, what in the devil's name are you doing here? This isn't a West End drawing room, and it isn't one of your fashionable murder trials." "No, indeed," Wimsey sighed, lighting his cigarette with a gentle hiss of sulfur. "It is far more serious. It is an inquiry into why a gentleman who intended to leave you the Priory at 3 o'clock was so thoroughly convinced by 4 o'clock that you were an unmitigated scoundrel, and why he died at 5 o'clock before he could sign the clean copy of the document that would have ruined you." The silence that followed was absolute, save for the steady ticking of the long case clock in the hall outside. Julian turned pale, his hands clenching into fists at his sides. "What are you implying?" the young man whispered. "I imply nothing," Wimsey said mildly, stepping further into the room and glancing down at the polished floorboards. "I am merely fascinated by the mathematics of the situation. At 3 o'clock you were seen leaving the library after a, shall we say, spirited exchange of views with your uncle. At 3:30 you were seen walking toward the village in the pouring rain without an umbrella. At 4 o'clock, Mr. Vance arrives with the draft. At 4:15, Mr. Alistair joins the conference. At 5 o'clock, the old gentleman falls dead. It is a timeline of exquisite, almost artistic precision. "I was at the Black Bull by 4 o'clock, Julian declared fiercely. "The landlord saw me. The barmaid served me a whiskey. I stayed there until I heard the church bells tolling for the dead." "Did you?" Wimsey tilted his head, his eyes fixing on the lower hem of Julian's trousers. "Then it is truly remarkable, my dear chap, how you managed to acquire fresh marsh clay on the turn-ups of your evening trousers while sitting in the tap-room of the Black Bull, a room which, if my memory of provincial hostelries serves me, is paved entirely with red Staffordshire brick." Julian Thorndyke's gaze dropped instantly to his own ankles. The fine, dark wool of his trouser cuffs, saturated with moisture, bore a thin, undeniable crusting of yellowish-grey silt, the distinctive greasy clay found nowhere in the parish save the drainage ditches bordering the Priory's western orchard. A sudden flush of dark, mottled colour rose from his collar, burning against his pale cheeks. I went for a walk to clear my head," Julian stammered, his earlier defiance crumbling into a frantic, uneven rhythm. "I was furious. I walked past the orchard toward the weir." "Is it a crime now to tread on my own family's soil, Wimsey? Or are you suggesting I crawled back through the mud to murder the old man while Vance and Alistair were sitting in the very room with him?" "My dear Julian," Lord Peter murmured, taking a slow, deliberate draw from his cigarette and watching the blue smoke curl toward the molded plaster ceiling, "I suggest nothing of the sort. I am merely a man who suffers from a grotesque, almost diseased passion for detail. When a gentleman claims he has spent 2 hours on a pub stool, yet carries half an acre of the lower orchard on his boots, my poor, feeble mind becomes dreadfully confused." Superintendent Smedley stepped forward, his heavy boots giving a warning creak against the oak floorboards. His thick fingers twitched near his belt as he eyed the young man. "Now then, Mr. Julian, you didn't mention this little promenade to me when I took your statement down at the Black Bull half an hour ago. You said you walked straight from the front gate to the village street." "Because it wasn't relevant," Julian shot back, his voice rising in pitch. "I didn't think I needed to account for every puddle I stepped into while I was trying to digest the news that my uncle was turning me out into the street. I went near the orchard because I thought of going to the stables. I thought of taking my horse and riding to London to see our family bankers before Vance could lock up the estate. But I changed my mind. I went to the pub instead. Ask the barmaid." "Oh, we shall," Wimsey said softly. "We shall certainly ask the fair maiden of the tap-room whether you arrived at 4 o'clock looking like a drowned rat, or at 4:30 looking like a drowned rat who had recently been wrestling with a ditch." He turned away from Julian with an air of mild detachment, his eyes drifting back to the turnip-faced solicitor. "Tell me, Mr. Vance, when Mr. Septimus was reading this revised codicil aloud to you and Alistair, did he use his usual reading glass?" Vance raised his heavy eyelids, his expression remaining as impassive as a legal deed written on vellum. "He did, Lord Peter. The large binocular magnifier with a silver handle, the one presented to him by the Antiquarian Society in 1905. It usually resides on the left side of his bureau." "And was it on the left side of his bureau when he dropped dead?" I believe it was on the carpet," Vance said, pausing as if retrieving the visual memory from a dusty filing cabinet. "Yes, near his right hand. It had slipped from his fingers as he collapsed." "Curious," Wimsey whispered, half to himself. "A man who is profoundly deaf in his left ear sits with his left side to an unlatched garden window, holding a heavy magnifying glass in his right hand. He reads a document that strips his nearest relative of an inheritance, yet when he falls, the glass lands on his right, the document remains neatly blotted on the table, and his velvet jacket shows distinct traces of having been pinned against a hard surface by someone standing directly over him." "Lord Peter," Superintendent Smedley interrupted, rubbing his chin with a thick thumb, "are you implying the old gentleman was assaulted before he had his stroke?" "I am implying, my dear Smedley, that stroke or no stroke, there was a third presence in that library, or at the very least a very active second presence that wasn't merely sitting by the window admiring the English drizzle." Wimsey turned smoothly to Bunter, who stood immobile near the door. "Bunter, where is the late Mr. Thorndyke's reading glass at this moment?" "It is currently resting upon the tray in the library, my lord," Bunter replied instantly. "I took the liberty of securing it in a clean linen napkin to prevent any further atmospheric contamination or accidental handling." "Good. We shall inspect it presently." Wimsey turned his gaze toward the dark corridor leading to the west wing. In the meantime, I feel it would be the height of discourtesy if we did not pay a brief, sympathetic call upon our tropical friend, Mr. Alistair Thorndyke. A bout of ague in a drafty Norfolk priory must be a devastating experience for a gentleman accustomed to the balmy, malaria-ridden charms of Malaya. "He's asleep, Lord Peter," Vance cautioned, rising slowly from his chair. The local apothecary left him a draught of camphor and quinine before the police arrived. He was shaking violently. "Then we shall creep into his chamber with the delicacy of nightingales," Wimsey said cheerfully, stepping out into the hall. "A nervous system so finely tuned that it collapses at the mere sound of a cousin dying is a thing to be studied with reverence." The corridor leading to the west wing was colder and considerably darker than the central house. The smell of old oak and beeswax gave way to a damp, musty draught that smelled faintly of river mud and decaying stone. Here, the portraits on the walls were older, their faces obscured by centuries of yellowed varnish, stiff Elizabethan ancestors with high ruffs and pale, merciless eyes that seemed to follow the small procession as Wimsey, Smedley and Bunter moved quietly down the runner carpet. At the far end of the wing, a sliver of yellow light showed beneath a heavy iron-studded door. Before Wimsey could reach out to knock, the door creaked slowly inward, revealing a bedroom that looked more like a museum of natural oddities than a guest chamber. The air inside was suffocatingly warm, driven by a roaring peat fire in a narrow grate. The walls were lined with wooden cases containing stuffed birds of brilliant, iridescent plumage, hornbills with grotesque, helmet-like beaks, emerald parakeets, and vast, shadowy nightjars mounted on artificial branches. On the bedside table, among bottles of dark medicine and a half-empty glass of barley water, stood a brass spirit burner that sputtered with a faint blue flame, emitting the sharp, medicinal odor of eucalyptus and scorched oil. In the center of a massive four-poster bed lay Alistair Thorndyke. He was a small, withered man of perhaps 55, though his skin was so deeply tanned and lined by tropical suns that he looked 20 years older. His sparse grey hair clung damply to his forehead, and his eyes, bright and yellowed around the irises like those of a sick hawk, darted nervously toward the doorway as the visitors entered. "Who's that? What is it?" Alistair's voice was a thin, dry rustle, like dry bamboo rubbing together in a breeze. He pulled a thick woolen counterpane tighter around his throat, his shoulders shivering violently under the blankets. "Smedley, is that you? Has that hysterical boy been cleared out of the house yet?" "Mr. Julian is still downstairs, sir," Smedley said, stepping into the room with a softer tread than usual. "This is Lord Peter Wimsey, sir. He's assisting us with a few routine inquiries regarding your late cousin's final moments." Alistair's yellowed eyes shifted to Wimsey, calculating and sharp despite the visible tremor in his hands. "Wimsey? The Duke's brother? What's a Wimsey doing in this miserable bog? Come to watch an old man freeze to death in his ancestors' ruins?" "On the contrary," Wimsey said mildly, stepping toward the bedside table and regarding the brass spirit burner with polite interest. "I came to admire your hornbills, Mr. Thorndyke. A remarkable collection. The Buceros rhinoceros over near the wardrobe is a particularly fine specimen. Did you collect it yourself in Pahang, or was it purchased from a dealer in Singapore?" Alistair blinked, caught off guard by the question. "Pahang," he muttered, his shivering subsiding for a second. 1912, shot it on the lip of the July River. "What has that got to do with poor Septimus?" "Nothing whatsoever," Wimsey said with an engaging, utterly foolish smile. "I am a man of childish distractions. But tell me, when you were standing at the library window this afternoon, observing the weather while your cousin was reading his testament, did you happen to notice whether the window was open at the bottom?" Alistair's hand, resting on the edge of the blanket, tightened into a claw. "Open? In November? On the edge of the wash? Don't be absurd, man." The window was shut tight. Septimus would have had an ifit if a breath of cold air entered that room. "And yet," Wimsey murmured, reaching out with one gloved finger to gently touch the rim of a small wooden box that sat on the bedside table beside the spirit burner, "the room smelled distinctly of burnt feathers when we entered it shortly after 5. a most peculiar odor for a room with closed windows and a coal fire. Alistair's face seemed to draw even tighter, the skin stretching over his cheekbones until he resembled a dried anatomical specimen. "I smell nothing here but eucalyptus and my own sickness," he snapped, turning his face toward the wall. "If you've come to accuse me of something, speak out. If not, let a sick man rest. The old man chose to leave his property to me because I am the last of the direct line who hasn't wasted his substance on horses and women. It was his right." "Unquestionably," Wimsey said softly. "A man has every right to leave his money to whom he pleases, provided, of course, that he is the one who actually writes the name upon the parchment." He turned on his heel and walked toward the door, stopping just at the threshold to look back over his shoulder. "Oh, by the way, Mr. Thorndyke," Wimsey added casually, "Bunter was good enough to assist with your luggage earlier. He noticed that one of your iron-bound sea chests was locked with a rather unusual combination lock of Oriental design, a 4-letter sequence, if I am not mistaken." Alistair did not turn his head, but his breathing grew shallow and rapid in the quiet room. "It contains my private papers," he said coldly, "and my journal from the Federated States." "Fascinating," Wimsey said. "I have always had a great weakness for journals. They contain such extraordinary, unexpected revelations, especially when the ink is fresh." The door of the tropical bedchamber clicked shut behind them with a soft, decisive thud that seemed to seal in the oppressive heat of eucalyptus and peat. In the dim corridor, illuminated only by the flickering wall sconces, Superintendent Smedley paused, his boots creaking as he shifted his bulk from one foot to the other. His expression was a study in profound provincial bewilderment, mixed with the growing irritation of an officer of the law who suspects he is being shown a card trick he cannot quite follow. "Now then, Lord Peter," Smedley began, keeping his voice down to a heavy rumble that barely carried above the whistling draft, "what was all that business about combination locks and fresh ink? Are you suggesting Mr. Alistair has been forging documents in his sea chest while pretending to have the ague?" "My dear Smedley," Wimsey said, leaning against the dark paneling and producing his silver case to extract another Turkish cigarette, "I suggest nothing half so dramatic yet. Forgery is a vulgar, laborious art, requiring a steady hand, tracing paper, and an exquisite memory for another man's capital letters. Alistair Thorndyke may be many things, a collector of stuffed birds, a sufferer of tropical chills, and a gentleman of singularly elastic ethics, but he is not a clerk with a bottle of Indian ink." "Then why mention the chest at all, my lord?" "Because, my dear Superintendent," Wimsey murmured, striking a match against his fingernail and watching the tip glow, "a man who keeps his journal locked under a 4-letter combination code is a man who believes his private thoughts are safe from the prying eyes of housemaids. And when a man believes his thoughts are entirely safe, he becomes terribly, delightfully careless about what he writes down." He turned to Bunter, who stood behind them in the shadow like a well-tailored statue. "Bunter, my lord." While Mr. Alistair was shivering so convincingly beneath his counterpane, "Did you observe the small table beside the washstand?" "I did, my lord," Bunter replied smoothly. A small glass tumbler, 3 parts filled with water, containing a white deposit near the rim. Additionally, a small pair of steel tweezers resting upon a sheet of blotting paper. The blotting paper, if I may observe, bore 3 fresh impressions of a circular nature, approximately 2 inches in diameter. 2 inches, Wimsey repeated softly, his eyes sparkling with that peculiar, sharp light that invariably signaled the scent of prey. "The exact diameter, unless my visual memory utterly fails me, of the brass-bound brass lens from the library, the very glass that Septimus Thorndyke allegedly dropped when he succumbed to his apoplectic fit." Smedley frowned, rubbing his broad chin until it scraped like sandpaper. "Wait a minute, are you saying Alistair took the old man's reading glass up to his bedroom after the death?" "I am saying, Smedley, that the reading glass in the library has traveled more miles this afternoon than a commercial traveler with a line of cheap calico," Wimsey said. "Consider the chronology, my dear fellow. It is the anchor upon which this entire tragic melodrama hangs. Let us reassemble the afternoon, minute by agonizing minute. He began to pace slowly down the corridor, his boots making no sound upon the thick runner carpet, counting off the points on his long, aristocratic fingers. "At 3 o'clock, Wimsey said. Julian Thorndyke has his row with his uncle." High words, accusations of Newmarket debts, followed by Julian flinging out of the house in a temper. He walks through the orchard, acquiring our friend the local yellow clay on his heels, and makes his way toward the village. At 3:30, Julian is seen entering the Black Bull. The barmaid serves him. He stays there, nursing his grievance and his whiskey, until 5 o'clock. Now, return to the Priory. At 4 o'clock, Mr. Vance arrives with the draft of the new codicil. He enters the library. Septimus is sitting at his bureau. Alistair is present. The whole clock, the deadbeat escapement by Tompion, strikes 4. Between 4 o'clock and 4:30, Septimus reads the codicil aloud, objects to certain clauses, demands alterations, and finally, according to Vance and Alistair, collapses dead across the Persian rug. The time of death is fixed by Vance as precisely 4:45. Wimsey stopped pacing, turning to face Smedley with a thin, mocking smile. "It is a beautiful timeline, Smedley. It is tidy, respectable, and verified by 3 separate gentlemen, including an officer of the court. There is only one small, wretched, devastating flaw in the entire structure." "And what's that?" Smedley asked, his voice betraying a reluctant fascination. "The clock in the hall," Wimsey said quietly. "When we arrived at 5:15, that magnificent Tompion timepiece read 5:35. It was 20 minutes fast. Now, a Tompion clock of that period does not suddenly gain 20 minutes in an afternoon unless some enterprising human hand has physically advanced the minute hand." "Why would anyone do that?" Smedley blurted out. "If you're going to alter a clock to give yourself an alibi, you set it back, not forward. Setting it forward makes it look as though things happened later than they did. Unless," Wimsey replied, his voice dropping an octave, "you need the death to appear to have occurred after a certain event, rather than before it. Or unless you need to convince a deaf old gentleman whose pocket watch is on his dressing table upstairs that it is 40 minutes later than it actually is, in order to hurry him into signing a document before the arrival of an unexpected guest." He turned on his heel and began to walk back toward the central hall, where the great staircase curved upward into the gloom of the upper floors. "Come, gentlemen. It is time we revisited the scene of the crime, not to look at the corpse, which has already told us all it knows, but to examine the stationery." They returned to the library. The room remained as they had left it, chilled by the damp air weeping from the chimney and smelling faintly of carbolic, old leather, and that elusive, ghost-like scent of burnt feathers. The body of Septimus Thorndyke had been covered with a dark velvet carriage rug by the local constable, who now stood guard by the door, looking uncomfortable and standing at rigid attention as Wimsey entered. On the heavy oak bureau lay the famous codicil, 3 sheets of crisp, blue-lined legal foolscap, written in Mr. Vance's neat, copperplate hand. Wimsey did not touch the parchment. Instead, he leaned over it, adjusting his monocle and inspecting the dark blue ink of the signature at the bottom of the final page. "Bunter," Wimsey said softly. "My lord, bring the silver tray with the late gentleman's reading glass." Bunter stepped forward, presenting the tray with the solemnity of a priest bearing a relic. Wimsey picked up the heavy magnifier by its silver handle, taking care to hold it through a clean handkerchief. He held it over the signature on the codicil, peering through the thick, polished glass. "Look here, Smedley," Wimsey said, stepping aside to make room for the superintendent. "Look at the signature, Septimus Horatio Thorndyke. Look at the cross on the T in Septimus and the final flourish on the E in Thorndyke." Smedley leaned down, squinting through the glass. "Looks ordinary enough to me. A bit shaky, maybe, like an old man's hand." "It is shaky," Wimsey agreed. "But look at the ink, man. The main stroke of the name is written in dark blue iron gall ink, precisely matching the text of the document written by Vance. But the cross on the T and the flourish on the E, the 2 small strokes made when a man finishes writing his name, are written in an ink that is slightly darker, with a faint greenish sheen under the light." Smedley straightened up, his eyes widening. 2 different inks? In the same signature? 2 different pens, 2 different inks, and I am willing to stake my reputation as a judge of port. 2 different occasions, Wimsey declared. Someone wrote the name Septimus Thorndyke on this sheet before the document itself was written, or completed a blank signature that had been left for another purpose. A blank signature? Vance's dry, rustling voice spoke from the doorway. The solicitor had re-entered the room quietly, his turnip-like face paler than before in the dim light of the library lamps. He held his leather briefcase clamped under his arm like a shield. "Lord Peter," Vance said, his voice measured and icy, "are you suggesting that I, a partner in a firm that has served the gentry of this county for a century, brought a forged or pre-signed document into this house?" "I am suggesting, Mr. Vance," Wimsey said, turning to face him with absolute, lethal politeness, "that you are a very clever lawyer who found himself in a very dreadful predicament. You came here today at 4 o'clock expecting to meet old Septimus and have him sign a genuine codicil reinstating Julian. But when you arrived, you found Septimus already dead on the floor, having expired not at 4:45, but at 3:30, shortly after his furious quarrel with his nephew. The silence in the library was so dense that the patter of rain against the window panes sounded like the steady ticking of a fatal clock. Vance did not move a muscle. "A monstrous accusation," he whispered, "without a shadow of proof." "Proof?" Wimsey echoed softly, a cold, dangerous smile touching the corners of his mouth. "My dear Vance, the proof is currently sitting in a glass tumbler in Mr. Alistair's bedroom and hanging from the drainpipe outside this window. You and Alistair were in this together from the moment you realized the old man had died without signing the new will that favored Alistair, the will that would have saved your firm from the ruinous audit currently threatened by the Diocesan Restoration Fund." The accusation hung in the damp library air like heavy smoke, suffocating in its sudden, stark clarity. Superintendent Smedley looked from Lord Peter Wimsey to the attorney, his broad face flushed with incredulity, his hand instinctively falling toward his belt as if expecting the parchment-faced lawyer to make a desperate break for the drenched lawns. Mr. Gabriel Vance did not flee. He merely stood frozen in the doorway, his leather briefcase clamped against his ribs like a shield against a mortal blow. The turnip-like skin of his face seemed to shrink over his sharp cheekbones, taking on the gray, waxy texture of lard left too long in a larder. When he finally spoke, his voice was no longer the dry, pompous rattle of an officer of the court. It was thin, raspy, and dangerously brittle. "You are playing a very dangerous game, Lord Peter," Vance whispered, his small, dark eyes glinting behind his spectacles. "To accuse a solicitor of highest repute of fraud, forgery, and conspiracy in the presence of the police, if you cannot substantiate every syllable of this outrageous slander, the damages will ruin even a duke's brother." "My dear Vance," Wimsey said, leaning back against the edge of the carved oak bureau with an expression of supreme, nonchalant confidence, "if I had a sovereign for every time an indignant scoundrel threatened me with a libel suit, I should be able to purchase the British Museum and keep it as a private summer house. Let us not waste our time on legal threats. They are so dreadfully tedious before dinner." He reached out with a single gloved finger and tapped the blue foolscap page resting on the blotter. "Consider the sheer, beautiful madness of the gamble you took this afternoon. At 3:30, old Septimus Thorndyke has a violent, terrifying quarrel with his nephew Julian. Julian leaves in a fury, slamming the front door so hard the iron knocker rattles. Septimus, left alone, sits down at his desk in a state of apoplectic rage. His heart, weakened by 82 years of pure venom, gives a final, agonizing flutter, and down he goes across the Tabriz rug." Superintendent Smedley took a step closer, his heavy brows knit in concentration. "And Julian was already halfway to the village, my lord." "Precisely," Wimsey said, gesturing with his monocle. "Julian walked out at 3:30. He was at the Black Bull by 3:45, nursing his grievances in plain sight of the landlord and the taproom barmaid. He had the most pristine, unbreakable alibi for the time between 3:30 and 5 o'clock. And that, my dear Smedley, was the precise tragedy that confronted Mr. Gabriel Vance when he arrived at 4 o'clock with his clerk's draft of the old will, the will that left everything to Julian." Vance's fingers twitched against his leather briefcase, but he remained silent, staring at Wimsey with a cold, unblinking intensity. "Picture the scene," Wimsey continued, his light voice adopting the dramatic cadence of an actor rehearsing a prologue. Vance arrives at 4 o'clock. The front door is unbolted by the grim Grimble. Vance walks into the library to meet his client. What does he find? Not an irascible old gentleman waiting to sign his papers, but a stone-dead corpse on the Persian rug. Septimus had been dead for at least half an hour. The room was cold, the hearth fire was dying down. "And if Septimus died at 3:30, Smedley interjected, his eyes lighting up as the logical gears finally meshed in his mind, "then the old will of 1921 stands. The disinherited nephew Julian gets the entire estate, the priory, and the Thorndyke debentures." "Exactly," said Wimsey. "Julian gets everything. And why was that fatal for Mr. Gabriel Vance? Because Julian, whatever his faults with horses and Newmarket bookmakers, is not a fool about money. The moment Julian came into his inheritance, he would have instructed an independent London accountant to examine the Thorndyke trust funds. And what would those accountants have discovered, Vance?" Wimsey's voice dropped its light, mocking tone, striking the cold, heavy note of an iron bell. "They would have discovered that for the past 7 years, Vance and Harker have been quietly liquidating the Diocesan Restoration Fund debentures to cover their own catastrophic losses in South American railway stocks. The money was gone. If Julian inherited, the firm faced bankruptcy, public disgrace, and the penal settlement at Dartmoor." A low, involuntary gasp escaped Vance's bloodless lips. His hand slipped an inch down his briefcase, but he swallowed hard, trying to force his trembling chin upward. "Speculation," he breathed. "Wild, baseless speculation." "Is it?" Wimsey smiled thinly. "A simple wire to the bishop's legal secretary in Lincoln tomorrow morning will settle the matter of the debentures beyond all doubt, but let us finish our drama of 4 o'clock. Vance is standing over the body in panic. His firm is ruined. But then, a stroke of devilish, unexpected luck. Outside the library window, standing in the rain near the drain pipe, is Mr. Alistair Thorndyke, the long-lost tropical cousin who had arrived 3 weeks ago, desperately needing money to settle his own mountain of debts in Singapore. Wimsey walked toward the bay window, pointing to the dark rain pipe outside. Alistair had been prowling around the terrace, trying to spy on his uncle's conference through the glass. He saw Septimus collapse at 3:30. He realized the terrible truth before Vance even arrived. When Vance walked into the room at 4, Alistair stepped through the French window or tapped on the pane and presented Vance with a proposition. "A conspiracy," Smedley growled, glaring at the lawyer. "A pact between two desperate men." "The most logical arrangement in the world," Wimsey agreed. "Alistair says to Vance, if Septimus died at 3:30, Julian gets everything, you go to prison, and I return to Malaya, a penniless beggar. But if we can prove Septimus lived until after 4 o'clock, and that he executed a new codicil leaving the entire estate to me, I will cover your shortages from the estate funds, and you will save your firm from ruin." "My lord," Bunter's calm, deferential voice broke in from near the hearth. "If I may remind your lordship, the late Mr. Thorndyke was known to be exceedingly firm regarding his refusal to execute any document without reading every word aloud in the presence of witnesses." "Thank you, Bunter," Wimsey said gracefully. "A crucial point. Old Septimus was famously, obsessively paranoid about legal phrasing. Everyone in the village knew he always read his wills aloud before signing them. So how were Vance and Alistair to convince the household and the law that Septimus was alive and reading a document in this room between 4 o'clock and 4:30, when he was in fact lying dead on the floor? Superintendent Smedley stared at the hearth, then at the corpse under the carriage rug, and finally at the window. "The clock!" he exclaimed. "The Tompion clock in the hall." "Partly, my dear Smedley," Wimsey said. Vance slipped out into the hall at 4 o'clock while the servants were at tea in the basement kitchen. He moved the hands of the Tompion clock forward by 20 minutes. Why? To narrow the window of time, to create a frantic, hurried atmosphere, and to make anyone who looked at their watch believe the hour was far later than it was. But moving a clock does not create the sound of an old man's voice reading a will through a closed library door. Wimsey turned suddenly, his light blue eyes fixing directly upon Vance's trembling spectacles. "How did you make the dead man speak, Vance? How did you produce that dry, raspy, droning voice that Grimble the butler heard coming from this room at 4:15 while he was setting the tea tray in the dining room across the hall?" Vance's teeth began to chatter, a tiny, dry clicking sound in the quiet room. He took a step backward, his shoulder bumping hard against the door frame. "He didn't make the dead man speak," Wimsey answered his own question softly. "He didn't need to. Because Alistair Thorndyke, who had spent 20 years in the East, was an extraordinarily accomplished mimic, and because Septimus Thorndyke's voice, weakened by age and malice, was nothing more than a dry, rhythmic, rasping monotone." Wimsey stepped closer to Vance, his monocle swinging on its black silk ribbon. Alistair stood near the door inside this room at 4:15, reading the draft of the new codicil aloud in a perfect rasping imitation of his dead cousin's voice, while Vance sat at the table pretending to blot the page. To Grimble, listening casually from the passage, it sounded precisely as it had sounded 50 times before, old Septimus droning through his legal papers. "My God," Smedley muttered under his breath, a cold sweat breaking out on his forehead. A dead man's voice, produced by an actor over his body. "And then came the master stroke," Wimsey continued, his tone mounting in steady, rhythmic intensity. "They needed a signature, but Septimus was dead, his hand was cold and stiffening. Vance had in his briefcase an old, unexecuted deed from 1923 which Septimus had signed at the bottom before deciding not to go forward with the land sale, a blank signature on a sheet of legal paper. Vance expertly trimmed the margins, drafted the new codicil above the genuine signature, and added the small cross on the T and the flourish on the E, using his own fountain pen to join the old ink to the new text. Wimsey paused, letting the silence settle like a heavy weight upon the terrified lawyer. "There was only one thing they forgot," Wimsey said gently. "One small, absurd, tragic physical detail that neither a crooked solicitor nor a tropical mimic could possibly anticipate. And that detail, Vance, is why you are going to hang." Vance's knees appeared to give way beneath him, his tall, gaunt frame sagging against the heavy oak door frame like a coat dropped from a peg. The leather briefcase slipped from his nerveless fingers, striking the parquet floor with a dull, hollow thud that echoed into the silent corridor. His mouth opened and closed twice, but no sound emerged, save for a dry, rattling gasp that sounded horribly like the dead man's own throat. The detail," Vance rasped out at last, his spectacles slipping crookedly down his moist, twitching nose. "What detail, you devil? There was no flaw. The paper was genuine. The ink matched. The signature was his own." "The signature was indeed his own, my dear Vance," Wimsey said, his voice dropping into a register of quiet, devastating precision. "And that was precisely your undoing. You see, when a man sits down to execute a document in life, he uses his own eyes, or at the very least, his customary spectacles. But Septimus Thorndyke was utterly dependent upon that heavy, silver-handled binocular magnifier, the very glass currently resting upon Bunter's tray." Wimsey stepped to the tray, lifting the heavy silver magnifier with extreme care. When Septimus signed a document, he invariably placed the lens directly upon the paper with his left hand, holding his pen in his right. The bottom rim of this silver casing left a faint, distinct circular indentation in the damp paper around the capital letters of his name, a physical mark that no amount of smooth blotting can ever entirely eradicate. Superintendent Smedley leaned in, his eyes bulging as he stared at the blue foolscap page on the bureau. "And there's no ring on that codicil?" "None whatsoever," Wimsey replied smoothly. "Because when Septimus signed that blank sheet of paper back in 1923 for the land sale, he was sitting at his desk in broad daylight, using his ordinary reading spectacles. But today, when you and Alistair staged this pathetic little charade over his corpse, you realized too late that the reading glass was missing from the desk. You found it lying under his dead hand on the carpet. Alistair carried it upstairs to his room, frantic to see if it bore any telltale smudges of his own fingers, and washed it in a tumbler of water, leaving those 3 wet ring marks on his bedside blotting paper that Bunter so intelligently observed. "A tumbler of water," Smedley echoed, turning his heavy, menacing gaze back upon the trembling lawyer. "And the smell of burnt feathers, Lord Peter? The acrid tang in the air when we first came into this room?" "Ah," Wimsey smiled, though his light blue eyes remained as cold as Arctic ice. "That was the most exquisite touch of all, the grotesque, tropical flourish provided by our friend Mr. Alistair. You see, Smedley, when Septimus collapsed at 3:30, he did not die instantly. A stroke of that severity often leaves a man breathing, stertorous, rattling breathing that can persist for 20 minutes or half an hour before the heart finally surrenders. When Vance arrived at 4, Septimus was still alive, lying on that carpet, gasping for air." Smedley gasped, his large hand flying to his mouth in horror. "Alive? They found him alive." "They found him dying," Wimsey corrected gently. "And to 2 desperate men whose entire plot depended upon establishing a precise sequence of events, a dying man who might linger until the doctor arrived was a fatal inconvenience. They could not risk him recovering speech, even for a second. Nor could they shoot him, stab him, or pour poison down his throat without leaving the clumsy, glaring marks of murder for Dr. Pringle to find." Wimsey walked back toward the fireplace, his tone becoming dangerously calm. "So Alistair, drawing upon his long experience with native remedies and forest lore in the Malayan jungle, produced a tiny piece of dry cord, hemp dipped in a concentrated solution of dried toad venom and sulfur, a common native poison used on blowpipe darts. He ignited a fraction of an inch of that cord beneath the dying man's nostrils." "Good Lord," Smedley whispered, his face turning pale beneath his weathered skin. "It suffocated him." "It induced an immediate, violent spasm of the larynx," Wimsey said, pointing to the lapels of the dead man's velvet jacket. "Septimus gasped, choked, and died within 10 seconds, his fingers clutching frantically at his own throat and lapels, which accounts for the crushed nap of the velvet and the smell of burnt feathers and bitter oil that hung in the air when we arrived. Alistair then opened the lower window just an inch to let the smoke escape, accidentally catching a strand of the coarse hemp cord on the iron drainpipe as he leaned out to dispose of the burning remnant. A terrible, strangled shriek echoed down the corridor from the west wing, a high, piercing sound of fury and despair that was cut off sharply by the sound of breaking glass and a heavy body striking the floorboards above. "The window!" Smedley roared, wheeling around and charging out of the library into the hall, his heavy boots thundering like iron hammers against the oak floor. "He's trying to break out." "Bunter," Wimsey said with complete composure, adjusting his cuffs with meticulous care, "be so good as to step outside to the terrace beneath Mr. Alistair's bedchamber. I suspect our tropical avian collector is about to discover that the Lincolnshire clay is far less forgiving than the mud of the July River." "Very good, my lord," Bunter replied, bowing impeccably before gliding toward the French windows with the swift, noiseless motion of an oiled machine. Wimsey turned back to Gabriel Vance, who was now sitting on the floor, his back pressed against the base of the doorframe, his hands covering his face as dry, racking sobs shook his thin shoulders. The leather briefcase lay open beside him, its contents, a sheaf of blue papers and a small, silver-mounted seal, spilling out onto the dark wood. "You see, Vance," Lord Peter said, stepping over the scattered papers and looking down at the broken solicitor with a mixture of profound intellect and cold detachment, "the great tragedy of the criminal mind is not that it lacks imagination, but that it possesses entirely too much of it. A simple lie is a sturdy thing. It stands like an old barn against the wind, but a brilliant, complex, theatrical lie, a lie with altered clocks, imitation voices, and Malay poisons, is a house of cards. One pulls out a single insignificant card, such as a missing ring on a piece of foolscap, and the entire magnificent structure crashes down upon the architect's head." Heavy footsteps echoed outside, accompanied by the harsh, metallic clink of iron handcuffs and the deep, angry voice of Superintendent Smedley shouting for the local constable. Down the corridor, the front door bell began to chime. a slow, persistent, rhythmic ringing that announced the belated arrival of Dr. Pringle and the coroner's van. Wimsey picked up his grey fedora from the side table, brushing an imaginary speck of dust from its brim with his sleeve. He looked toward the window, where the rain was finally beginning to slacken, giving way to a pale, watery silver light that crept over the drowned marshes toward the sea. "The most unsatisfactory afternoon, Vance," Wimsey murmured, placing his hat upon his head at a jaunty, immaculate angle. "The muffins were leathery, the murder was vulgarly over-engineered, and I have ruined a remarkably good pair of town boots in your Lincolnshire mud. I shall have to ask Bunter to spend an hour with the saddle soap before we return to Piccadilly." The commotion from the west wing cascaded into the central hall in a flurry of muffled thuds, harsh curses, and the splintering of ancient pine. Superintendent Smedley's massive voice boomed over the din, commanding Constable Higgs to hold the rear stairs while iron boots clattered furiously across the upper floorboards. Lord Peter Wimsey did not join the scramble. He stood in the doorway of the library, watching with cool, clinical interest as two local constables, called up from the kitchen by the uproar, hauled Gabriel Vance to his feet. The solicitor's limbs were loose and limp, like those of a broken puppet whose strings had been severed in mid-performance. His spectacles dangled precariously from one ear, reflecting the dull amber glow of the hall lamps in twin, distorted circles. "Hold him fast by the elbows, mind you," Smedley shouted, re-emerging from the gloom of the West Wing passage, his face purple from exertion, his collar unbuttoned at the throat. He was half dragging, half guiding a twitching, mud-spattered figure whose wrists were already bound in gleaming steel cuffs. Alistair Thorndyke had not made it to the terrace. The damp window frame of his bedchamber had jammed half open under his frantic pressure, and in his desperation to force his way out onto the slippery stone sill, he had shattered 2 panes of leaded glass, slashing his coat sleeves to ribbons. Bunter, waiting below with the patient foresight of a spider beneath a rainspout, had merely stepped out from the shadows of the rhododendrons to catch the fleeing cousin as he tumbled awkwardly into the wet shrubbery. Alistair's tropical tan had turned a sickly, mottled grey. Blood from a minor glass cut on his temple dripped steadily down his cheek, mingling with the grease and soot of the chimney pipe he had attempted to grasp in his descent. His yellowed eyes rolled wildly in their sockets, fixing upon Wimsey with a burning, hysterical venom. "You damned, meddling popinjay," Alistair spat, his voice no longer a frail, shivering rustle, but a harsh, shrill scream that echoed off the high rafters of the hall. "What do you know of it? What does a pampered duke's son know of rotting 30 years in a swamp while an old miser sits on £100,000 and dies by inches? He promised me that money, he wrote to me in Penang, he lured me back to this icy, rotting hellhole, only to laugh in my face. My dear Mr. Thorndyke," Wimsey said, leaning his hip casually against the library door frame and adjusting his monocle. "If I had a sovereign for every relative who found the English climate inclement and his family's generosity insufficient, I should be able to subsidize the entire rubber industry of Malaya. But I assure you, strangling an octogenarian with the fumes of toad venom and framing his nephew is considered distinctly poor form, even in the most relaxed provincial circles." "It was Vance," Alistair shrieked, twisting violently in Smedley's grip and pointing a blood-stained, shaking finger at the weeping solicitor. "Vance brought the paper. Vance told me the old man hadn't signed the new draft. He said we had 40 minutes before the nephew came back from the pub. He said no one would ever question a signature that matched the 1923 land deed." "Quiet, you fool," Vance gasped out, lifting his wet face from his chest, his voice trembling with a sudden, desperate surge of legal instinct. "Say nothing. Hold your tongue. Every word you utter is a nail in our coffins." "The coffins, my dear Mr. Vance," Wimsey observed mildly, "already have their brass handles fitted and the velvet lining smoothed down. The timeline you constructed with such exquisite care has completely dissolved beneath your feet." At that moment, the heavy iron knocker on the front door clattered against the oak, 3 sharp, authoritative strikes that signaled the end of the household's private isolation. Grimble, appearing from the domestic quarters with his usual silent, sinister grace, glided past the tableau of police, criminals, and nobility to draw back the heavy brass bolts. The door swung inward, admitting a blast of cold, salt-laden wind, and Dr. Pringle, a small, round man with white whiskers, a black Gladstone bag, and an expression of profound, professional indignation at being summoned out into the marshland damp at such an unseemly hour. Behind him stood Dr. Malcolmson, the county coroner, clutching a leather roll of instruments and stamping his wet galoshes on the flagstones. "Good evening, Superintendent," Dr. Pringle bustled in, shaking his umbrella over the hall mat. "What is the meaning of this urgent summons? I was under the distinct impression from your earlier message that old Septimus had simply succumbed to his usual apoplectic tendency. I was preparing the death certificate when your constable came galloping down the lane as if the French had landed at Boston." "You may put your pen away for the natural causes certificate, Doctor," Smedley said grimly, tightening his grip on Alistair's collar. "Lord Peter Wimsey here has uncovered a case of willful murder, forgery, and conspiracy. You'll find the deceased in the library, and you'd best examine his throat for traces of poison gas and his velvet coat for violent handling." Dr. Pringle stopped dead, his round face flushing with astonishment as his eyes darted from the handcuffed tropical cousin to the broken solicitor crumpled between two constables, and finally to Lord Peter Wimsey, who gave him a polite, charming little bow. "God bless my soul," Pringle exclaimed, dropping his Gladstone bag onto a hall chair. "Murder, old Septimus, in my parish?" "The parish, Doctor," Wimsey murmured, "is entirely innocent. It is merely the setting for a somewhat squalid exercise in testamentary geometry. Bunter, do be a good fellow and see if Grimble can produce a bottle of the late gentleman's '84 port. I feel that Superintendent Smedley has earned a glass, and I am personally in dire need of something to wash the smell of burnt toad out of my nostrils." From the shadow of the dining room corridor, Julian Thorndyke stepped into the hall. He had watched the unmasking of his uncle's killers in absolute silence, his fox-like face pale, his dark eyes wide with a mixture of shock and profound relief. The rain-soaked mud of the lower orchard still clung to his evening boots, but the crushing weight of suspicion had lifted from his shoulders. He walked slowly toward Wimsey, his hands shoved deep into his coat pockets, stopping a few feet away from the aristocrat who had saved him from the gallows. "Wimsey," Julian said, his voice husky and uneven, I don't know what to say. If you hadn't noticed that clock, or the ink, I should have been arrested by midnight. Smedley was ready to take me down to the cells." "My dear Julian," Wimsey said, clapping the young man lightly on the shoulder, "never thank a man for pursuing a mathematical truth. It is a purely selfish pleasure. Besides, if you had been hanged for your uncle's murder, the estate would have escheated to the crown, and I should have been deprived of the opportunity to shoot your pheasants next October. A gentleman must protect his sporting calendar at all costs." Julian managed a faint, shaky laugh, wiping his forehead with the back of his hand. "The pheasants are yours, Lord Peter. The entire shoot, for as long as I live, a most satisfactory fee," Wimsey smiled. In the library, Dr. Pringle and the coroner had knelt beside the body of Septimus Thorndyke, lifting the carriage rug to begin their formal, rigorous examination under the sharp, unyielding light of Bunter's brass torch. The quiet routine of the law had begun to take hold, the measuring of temperature, the lifting of eyelids, the careful scraping of foreign particles from the dead man's velvet collar into tiny glass vials. Superintendent Smedley marched his two prisoners toward the door, where a covered police wagon stood waiting in the driveway, its oil lamps burning yellow against the pale, rain-washed darkness of the marshland night. Vance walked with his head bowed, silent and broken. Alistair continued to mutter under his breath, a stream of bitter, incoherent tropical curses that faded into the whistling wind as the heavy oak door closed behind them. Wimsey walked to the high bay window of the hall, looking out across the drive. The rain had ceased entirely now, leaving the ancient stones of Oakhaven Priory gleaming wetly beneath a breaking sky. A thin crescent moon showed through a rift in the ragged, flying clouds, casting a cold, silvery light over the drowned lawns and the distant line of the sea dike. Bunter appeared silently at his elbow, bearing a silver tray with two crystal glasses filled with a deep, ruby-red liquid. "The 1884 Taylor, my lord," Bunter announced softly. I took the liberty of decanting it myself. It has survived the late gentleman's cellar in admirable condition." Wimsey took a glass, lifting it toward the moonlight before taking a slow, appreciative sip. "Exquisite, Bunter, truly exquisite. It has a firmness of character that our friend Mr. Vance so lamentably lacked." "Indeed, my lord," Bunter agreed, holding his own tray with immaculate precision. "And if I may ask, my lord, what are your instructions regarding our luggage?" "We shall leave at dawn, Bunter," Lord Peter Wimsey said, his voice dropping into that light, ironic cadence that masked the sharp, relentless intellect beneath. "Back to London, back to Piccadilly, and back to civilization. I have had quite enough of country wills, tropical cousins, and Lincolnshire mud to last me until the spring. As the divine William so aptly observed, let's choose executors and talk of wills, and yet not so, for what can we bequeath save our deposed bodies to the ground?" The silver light of the moon, cold and unblinking, crept further across the flagstones of the great hall as the heavy oak door thudded shut for the final time. The police wagon, its iron-rimmed wheels grinding heavily through the saturated gravel, rumbled down the long avenue of limes toward the village road, taking Gabriel Vance and Alistair Thorndyke into the damp obscurity of the Lincolnshire night. Inside Oakhaven Priory, a sudden, heavy quiet descended, the peculiar, settling hush that always follows the storm of a violent exposure. The air remained chilled, carrying the persistent ghosts of damp tweed, carbolic soap, and the faint, bitter trace of burnt hemp that still lingered in the high, vaulted corners of the roof. In the library, the low, professional murmur of Dr. Pringle and Coroner Malcolmson continued in measured tones. The snip of scissors, the faint clinking of glass sample vials, and the scratching of a steel nib across official paper provided a stark, clinical accompaniment to the tragedy. Old Septimus Thorndyke had ceased to be a terrifying, irascible force of nature. He was now merely an entry in the county coroner's register, a physical problem solved by logic and the alignment of ink. Lord Peter Wimsey turned from the bay window, his glass of '84 port held delicately between thumb and forefinger. He observed Julian Thorndyke, who sat upon a low oak bench near the grand fireplace, staring blankly into the white ash of the hearth. "Drink your wine, my dear Julian," Wimsey said softly, stepping across the hall with a light, measured tread. "There is nothing quite so depressing as the aftermath of a successful investigation. When the villain is unmasked and the constables have departed with their handcuffs, one is invariably left with a cold room, an empty glass, and the uncomfortable realization that human nature is an utterly wretched piece of work." Julian accepted the glass offered by Bunter, his fingers trembling slightly as they brushed the crystal. He took a deep draught, letting out a long, ragged sigh that seemed to shake his young frame. "I can't grasp it, Wimsey," Julian confessed, staring into the deep ruby liquid. "Alistair, I knew he was a bitter, desperate devil when he arrived from Malaya. But Vance? Vance has managed the family account since my father was a boy. He sat at our table every Christmas. He drank my uncle's port. To think he stood over the old man's body to stage that gabbly performance." Vance, Wimsey remarked, settling himself onto the velvet arm of a carved settle, was a creature of strict, mechanical routine who allowed himself to be trapped by his own respectability. A scoundrel who sets out to be a villain from his cradle is rarely dangerous. He is too predictable. But a respectable country solicitor who slips into embezzlement is the most lethal animal on earth when the light of exposure begins to creep through his office shutters. He will commit forgery, subornation, and murder, not out of grand passion, but out of a sheer, terrifying horror of being found out at the local club. "And the poison?" Julian shuddered. "That horrifying toad stuff, an oriental curio brought home by our tropical cousin," Wimsey replied. "Alistair supplied the exotic method. Vance supplied the local knowledge and the legal paper. It was a partnership born in the lower depths of desperation. Had Vance not been so eager to save his firm from the diocesan audit, he would never have trusted Alistair. Had Alistair not been so penniless, he would never have relied upon Vance's neat, copperplate hand." From the dark corridor leading to the domestic offices, Grimble emerged, bearing a fresh brass lamp to replace one that was flickering out near the portrait gallery. The old butler's face remained a mask of carved granite, though his pale eyes lingered for a fraction of a second upon the spot where the dead man's will had been exposed as a fraud. "Will your lordship require supper served in the small dining room?" Grimble asked, his voice returning to its habitual iron-hinged monotone. "The cold fowl and ham have been prepared, though I fear the soufflé was entirely destroyed by the earlier interruptions." "Cold fowl will be a triumph, Grimble," Wimsey said, rising and tossing his cigarette end into the cold embers of the hearth. "And do be good enough to inform the cook that her muffins, though leathery at 5 o'clock, were an indispensable element in the pursuit of justice. Had they been piping hot and delicious, I might have been too thoroughly engrossed in eating them to notice the hall clock. I shall convey your lordship's compliments to the kitchen." Grimble bowed gravely, turning on his heel and gliding back into the shadows as silently as a ghost returning to a vault. "Doctor." Pringle stepped out of the library, pulling on his woolen driving gloves, his Gladstone bag once more secured under his arm. He looked solemn, though a faint gleam of professional satisfaction showed behind his spectacles. "Well, Lord Peter," Pringle said, pausing near the library door, "Malcolmson and I have completed our preliminary work. The cause of death is quite clear now. Acute asphyxiation brought on by violent laryngeal spasm, consistent with the inhalation of a toxic irritant. We found minute traces of carbon and ash upon the late gentleman's collar, precisely as you indicated. The official inquest will be opened at the courthouse on Tuesday morning. I shall be delighted to attend, Doctor," Wimsey smiled, "provided the coroner does not expect me to deliver a lecture on tropical toxicology. My knowledge of toad venom is entirely theoretical, derived from a rather tedious monograph published by the University of Leiden in 1892. Your theoretical knowledge, my lord," Pringle remarked dryly, "has saved this county a very considerable scandal and prevented a gross miscarriage of justice. Good night to you, Lord Peter. Good night, Mr. Julian." With a final nod, the doctor bustled out into the night, leaving the front door to settle back into its frame with a dull, heavy latch click. Julian stood up, looking around the vast, echoing hall that was now officially his own. The portraits of the Thorndikes, generations of stern, red-faced squires and stiff ladies in brocade, gazed down upon him from the oak-panelled walls. He was no longer the penniless, disgraced nephew facing ruin and Newmarket debts. He was the sole master of Oakhaven Priory, the debentures, and the marshland tenant farms. Yet he looked extraordinarily small and solitary standing beneath the grand timbered roof. "It feels strange, Wimsey," Julian said softly, looking up at the high gallery. "I spent 10 years wishing the old man would die or change his mind. I cursed him in every taproom in the district, and now that he's gone and the house is mine, I feel as though I've inherited a tomb." "Houses are never tombs, my dear chap," Wimsey said gently, taking his silver cigarette case from his pocket and snapping it shut with a crisp click. "They are merely vessels for the living. Oakhaven has spent 40 years being filled with malice, barley water, and old grudges. Pull down the heavy curtains, throw open the windows to the sea air, pay off your bookmakers, and invite some lively people down for the shooting. In 6 months the place won't even remember the smell of carbolic soap." "And you, Lord Peter?" Julian asked, looking at his guest with genuine warmth. "Will you come back for the shooting?" "Try and stop me," Wimsey laughed, his sharp, bird-like face lighting up with genuine, infectious good humor. "I have a standing engagement with your pheasants, remember, and I shall expect Bunter's quarters to be supplied with the finest saddle soap in the United Kingdom." Bunter stepped forward from the shadows, his expression impeccably neutral, though his hands held Lord Peter's heavy traveling ulster and silver-topped walking stick with practiced readiness. "The motor car is prepared, my lord," Bunter announced softly. "The local lad has topped the radiator with fresh water, and I have taken the liberty of wiping the marsh mud from the mudguards. The road through the village is clear, though we may encounter fog near the dike." "Splendid, Bunter," Wimsey declared, slipping his arms into the coat sleeves as Bunter held the garment with mechanical precision. "A midnight drive across the fens in a fog is precisely what we require to complete the atmosphere of Gothic romance. We shall be in London in time for breakfast at the club." He picked up his gloves and stick, turning to give Julian a final cheerful wave. "Good night, Master of Oakhaven," Lord Peter Wimsey called out as Bunter pulled open the heavy front door, revealing the crisp, cold air of the marshland night. "Mind the hall clock, keep an eye on your solicitors, and if a cousin arrives from the tropics bearing stuffed birds, lock the guest room door." With a light, springing step, Lord Peter Wimsey vanished out into the moonlight, leaving Oakhaven Priory to its ancient, silver silence. The heavy brass headlamps of the 1927 Daimler cut two fierce yellow cones through the creeping bank of fen fog that had rolled off the wash. The vapor clung low to the tarmac, swirling across the radiator cap in greasy white eddies that smelled of salt, reed bed decay, and damp earth. Inside the closed saloon, the high, leather-padded interior offered a cocoon of relative warmth, smelling faintly of expensive Virginia tobacco, polished mahogany, and petrol fumes. Lord Peter Wimsey leaned back against the deep buttoned leather, his heavy woolen ulster buttoned securely to the chin, watching the skeletal silhouettes of the roadside willows loom up out of the mist and slide silently past the glass like drowned sentinels. At the wheel, Bunter drove with the mechanical, icy composure that characterized his every action. His hands, encased in stout dogskin driving gloves, held the big steering wheel at the precise 10-2 position, his eyes fixed unwaveringly upon the white chalk line that marked the outer edge of the dike road. "A remarkably stubborn piece of vapor, Bunter," Wimsey observed, pulling a long silver pocket flask from his coat and unscrewing the cap with a faint metal rasp. "It has all the cloying, dramatic persistence of a cheap melodrama's second act. One expects a phantom coach and four to emerge from the hedge at any moment, driven by a headless postilion." "I am inclined to believe, my lord," Bunter replied, his voice maintaining its flat, respectful cadence above the low, purring thrum of the six-cylinder engine, "that the local atmosphere is heavily charged with excess moisture owing to the neglected state of the drainage ditches on the Thorndyke estate. A thorough dredging of the lower cut would undoubtedly improve the visibility on this section of the roadway." "Dredging?" Wimsey chuckled softly, taking a modest sip of cognac. "My dear Bunter, you have the soul of an engineer. Here we are, leaving the scene of a most intricate double conspiracy, a dead country gentleman, a fraudulent solicitor, and a tropical assassin, and your mind immediately turns to the local parish drainage board. One must consider the practicalities, my lord," Bunter said mildly, easing the Daimler round a sharp, treacherous curve where the road skirted the lip of a dark, stagnant canal. "A high-compression engine operates with considerable difficulty when the atmosphere approaches 90% saturation. Additionally, the mud accumulated upon the running boards during our departure from the Priory Terrace will require a thorough application of paraffin before it sets into the enamel." "You are an unanswerable comfort, Bunter," Wimsey murmured, settling his head back against the cushions. "While the rest of the world loses its head over motives and corpses, you keep yours firmly fixed upon enamel and paraffin." He fell silent for a few moments, watching the speedometer needle hover at a steady 35 miles per hour. Yet despite his relaxed posture, Wimsey's mind was clearly still running backward, restitching the threads of the afternoon's drama to ensure no loose strand had slipped through his fingers. "Tell me, Bunter," Wimsey said suddenly, his light voice sharpening slightly. "When you assisted Superintendent Smedley in securing Mr. Allister's personal effects from the West Wing, did you happen to notice the brass spirit burner on his bedside table?" "I did, my lord," Bunter answered without hesitation. It was a standard portable model, manufactured by a firm in Birmingham, though modified with a secondary air intake ring near the base, and the small wooden box beside it. Constructed of teak, my lord, lined with lead foil, it contained 3 small glass phials, 2 of which were empty. The third contained a dense, dark paste smelling strongly of camphor, lard, and dried vegetable matter. "Precisely," Wimsey nodded, his monocle catching a sudden flicker of yellow light from a distant farmstead lantern as they swept past. The vehicle for the toad venom. Allister was taking no chances. Had the smoke from the hemp cord failed to induce the fatal laryngeal spasm in old Septimus, he was prepared to introduce the paste into the old man's barley water during his evening call. The man was a thorough, painstaking worker in his own dreadful line. "A most unpleasant individual, my lord," Bunter remarked coldly. "I observed that he had permitted his razor strop to become dreadfully dry and cracked. A gentleman who neglects his cutlery is rarely to be trusted in matters of higher morality." Wimsey let out a sharp, sudden bark of laughter that echoed inside the saloon. "Bunter, you are sublime. A murderer may be forgiven his crimes against the crown, but a dry razor strop is the final proof of an unpardonable depravity." The Daimler began to climb slightly, leaving the lowest levels of the fen behind as the road rose onto the higher limestone ridge that led toward the market town of Spalding. The fog began to thin, tearing into long, ragged wisps that floated away over the darkened stubble fields like tattered grey ribbons. Ahead, the dim, yellow glow of a railway crossing gate appeared out of the murk. The heavy timber gates were swung shut across the road, a red oil lantern hanging from the central iron ring to warn late-night travelers of the midnight coal train from Doncaster. Bunter brought the heavy car to a smooth, silent halt a dozen yards from the tracks, the engine idling down to a barely audible tick-tick-tick beneath the long polished bonnet. "The crossing gate, my lord," Bunter announced. "We shall likely be delayed 3 or 4 minutes while the goods train passes." "No matter, Bunter," Wimsey said, leaning his arm against the lowered window sash and inhaling the cold, sharp air of the rising ground. "It gives one time to reflect upon the immense superiority of steam locomotives over human legal systems. A train runs upon fixed, unyielding steel rails. It cannot decide at 4 o'clock to alter its destination, pre-sign its coal tickets, or hire a tropical cousin to imitate its whistle." From down the line, a long, mournful whistle echoed through the night, followed by the heavy, rhythmic thud-thud-thud of a heavy freight engine laboring against the gradient. The door of the small timber crossing keeper's cottage clicked open, casting a narrow bar of orange lamplight across the wet gravel. A tall, stooped man in a heavy railway frieze coat stepped out, carrying a burning oil lantern in his gloved hand. He walked slowly toward the car, his heavy boots crunching on the stone. "Evening, sir," the crossing keeper called out, touching his cap as he recognized the fine lines of the Daimler. "Miserable night on the lower marsh." "Exceedingly damp, my friend," Wimsey replied cheerfully, leaning out the window. "Has the midnight goods from Doncaster kept to its schedule, or has the fog thrown the northern line into confusion?" "She's 10 minutes late, sir," the man said, resting his arm against the car door and blowing on his fingers to warm them. "Had to check her speed near the junction. We had the police wagon go through here 20 minutes back. Superintendent Smedley and 2 constables with a couple of prisoners in the back." Wimsey raised an eyebrow. "Ah, the superintendent is making good time toward the county guile, then." "Aye," the keeper snorted softly, though one of the chaps in the back was making a terrible racket, shouting about lawyers, forged papers and blood money until the superintendent threatened to put a canvas sack over his head to quiet him down, a right improper noise for a Friday night in a quiet parish. "The legal profession, my good man," Wimsey remarked with a dry, ironic smile, "is notoriously noisy when it finds itself on the wrong side of the dock. It is unaccustomed to the lack of right of reply." The heavy coal train roared past the crossing, a long, clattering procession of black wagons that shook the earth beneath the Daimler's tires and spat showers of red sparks up into the damp night air. The firelight from the locomotive's open furnace flashed across Wimsey's sharp, pale face, illuminating for a brief second the cool, calculating intelligence that lay just beneath his frivolous exterior. As the red tail lamp of the brake van vanished into the dark toward Peterborough, the crossing keeper pushed back the heavy wooden gates with a long iron crank, waving his lantern to signal the road was clear. "Good night to you, sir," the keeper shouted over the dying rumble of the tracks. "Safe journey to London." "Good night, my friend," Wimsey called back, pulling his head inside as Bunter let in the clutch with effortless smoothness. The Daimler surged forward across the iron rails, its headlamps reaching out once more to swallow the long, straight ribbon of road that led south toward Cambridge and the capital. Wimsey pulled his gold pocket watch from his waistcoat, a flat, exquisite piece of horological art by Breguet, and snapped open the hunter case. The tiny diamond hands pointed precisely to 20 minutes past 1. "Bunter," Wimsey said softly, closing the watch with a clean metallic click. "My lord, if we maintain our present speed, we shall reach the Great North Road by 2 o'clock. We can be at my flat in Piccadilly before 5. "That will allow ample time, my lord," Bunter replied, "for me to prepare a hot bath, draw the curtains, and press your lordship's morning suit before the shops open in Jermyn Street." "Capital," Lord Peter Wimsey sighed, stretching his long legs out into the footwell and closing his eyes as the car sped through the night. "And Bunter." "Yes, my lord. If anyone so much as mentions the word will, codicil, or estate before noon tomorrow, do be a good fellow and tell them I have gone to Malaya to collect hornbills."